The Civil War was fought between the Union Northern States and Southern Confederate States. After the Civil War ended in 1865, America needed to rebuild the South because of the destruction caused by the war and the differing Confederate governments. A Republican majority government presented plans to readmit the Southern states back in to be unified as one country. However, all three of the plans resulted in failure. The 10% plan was proposed by Lincoln but never actually put into action. The plan would pardon any Confederate who swore allegiance to the Union and the Constitution. The number of people who took an oath of allegiance had to equal 10% of the number of voters who participated in the election of 1860. And it required the organizing of a new state government which abolished slavery. Lincoln was assassinated before this plan could be put into effect. Presidential Reconstruction by Andrew Johnson stated that all land that had been confiscated by the Union Army and distributed to the freed slaves be reverted to its pre-war owners. It required the states to uphold the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, swear loyalty to the Union, and pay off war debts. Due to Johnson's leniency in his plan and his impeachment, the plan was in effect for barely 2 years. The final plan, Radical Reconstruction, lasted the longest from 1867 to 1877. Radical Reconstruction temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts with the military commander of the district given complete authority. It required that the 14th Amendment be ratified, which gave citizenship to former slaves and equal protection under the law. For some states, the 15th Amendment had to be ratified too, which guaranteed the right to vote for African American men. It also required that the Confederate government had to be destroyed. These attempts at Reconstruction all failed in some way. This video will cover the political, social, and economic reasons that Reconstruction failed after the Civil War. One of the reasons that Reconstruction failed politically is African Americans' votes were restricted. One of the goals of Reconstruction was upholding the 15th Amendment, which allowed African Americans to vote. This part of the plan failed in many ways. Many tried to restrict freedmen from voting by putting a poll tax in place and requiring a literacy test to be allowed to vote. This was a disadvantage to many freedmen who had hardly any money and couldn't pay the tax, nor could they pass the literacy test because many were uneducated and illiterate. Additionally, hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan threatened and used violence to try and stop African Americans from voting. Black and white politicians both got terrorized by the KKK. In 1868, less than 3% of voters were African American. Black codes were restrictive laws with the main purpose of restricting African Americans' freedoms. Black codes made it so freemen needed permission from white people to do things like go into or live in town, meet together in town, carry firearms, or be without a job. Often the punishment for black people was a large fine, which they usually couldn't pay, or working for white people, which was essentially going back to slavery ways. A specific example of a place with black codes would be Mississippi and parts of Louisiana. Another reason is the economic downfall of 1873 made people mad, so they elected in a Democrat majority to the House of Representatives. Democrats were mostly opposed to Reconstruction and encouraged military leaving of the South and the ending of Reconstruction. The social reasons that Reconstruction failed was that many hate groups could flourish. Hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts were created to terrorize African Americans and those that supported their new freedoms. Many Southern Democrats called this terrorization redemption. Enforcement laws were passed in 1871 to suppress these hate groups, but the ability to uphold these laws and keep the hate groups at bay was entirely dependent on military action. The willingness to use this military action was dwindling, and therefore the KKK was able to hate more openly without consequences. The second reason is systematic slavery or sharecropping. The system of sharecropping made it so freedmen were continuing to be dependent on white men's land. When freemen became free, they didn't have money to pay for land to farm on, so they struck a deal with the former plantation owners. They could farm on their land as long as they gave half of their harvest to the landowner. As they would live on the landowner's plantation, they would often buy food and clothing from the landowner's store on credit. The harvest would come, the landowner would get half and the freedman the other half. The landowner then would overestimate how much the freedman owed from the credit from the store. He would forgive the freedman's debt if he gave more crop the following year. Sharecropping system made it so black people were tied to working for plantation owners because they collected unknown debts while working on a contract. They were constantly in a cycle of debt that would prevent them from leaving. Sharecropping is systematic slavery, something that was supposed to be abolished because of Reconstruction. The presence of it in the South following the Civil War just shows how Reconstruction failed to accomplish its goals. Reconstruction failed due to economic reasons because it was very costly. It brought forth many new reforms, one of them being education reform. By 1875, over half of black children were attending school in Mississippi, Florida, and South Carolina. But this reform was costly, and Northerners were paying the high taxes to support Reconstruction in the South. After the economic panic of 1873 and the failure of the company building the Northern Pacific Railroad, many Americans were noticing how their pockets were even more empty. The economic downfall in stocks and an economic depression made Americans less willing to pay for expensive reconstruction of reform and military presence in the South. Most Northerners figured since Confederates were out of government and slavery was abolished that their job of Reconstruction was done. The decreasing popularity of Reconstruction because of its high cost enforced the reasoning to pull the military from the South, which essentially abandoned the efforts of Reconstruction. If why Reconstruction failed was to be a LEQ or DBQ, some complexity that might be of use would be comparing Reconstruction to after the Iraq War when Reconstruction was put in place, but it failed. It disrupted the political, social, and economic system. It spent over $49 billion to rebuild water, power supply, new schools, roads, housing, healthcare, and security. This still resulted in failure. Another example could be the Black Codes are similar to the Negro Act of 1740 that said no assembling together and need permission to go places for African Americans. The important things to know are the three Reconstruction plans, the 10% plan, which is not put into action, presidential Reconstruction, and radical Reconstruction. Also, why Reconstruction failed politically, it restricted voting rights, black codes, and Democrats in the House of Representatives. Socially, hate groups and systematic slavery with sharecropping, and economically, it was costly during a time of economic depression.